I think I have a
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to already fourth GVSU Virtual Climate Change Symposium. This is a part of our 28th Student Scholar Day at Grand Valley. And my name is Elena Lioubimtseva. I am a professor of geography and sustainable planning here at GVSU. And I am one of the founders of GVSU Climate Change Education Solutions Network. So this webinar will continue for the next couple of hours. We will finish shortly after 12:30. You are very welcome to stay with us the entire time of the session if your schedule allows, or you might be interested just in specific presentations. This session is going to be recorded, so if you want to share it later with your friends or want to suggest your students to watch it, you are very welcome, and you will find the recording both at the website of the Student Scholar Day website of the Office of Undergraduate Research and Scholarship, as well as on the website of GVSU CCS, Climate Change Education Solutions Network. So we are going to start by our first presentation, Climate Change and Its Efforts on Banana Production in Central America by Brailee, Duitsman, Amy, Simcox, and Miranda Gonyeau. And Brailee, Abby, and Miranda, welcome. You're our first presenter, and feel free to share your screens.
Thank you. Okay. So, as you guys heard, our project is climate change and its effects on banana production in Central America. And I'm Brailee. I'm Abby. I'm Miranda. In our abstract, we talked about climate change having an immense issue to the production of bananas in the economy that depends on this exported fruit in Central America. Environmental stressors on banana production can wreak havoc, such as changing weather patterns, drought, and rising temperatures. These stressors can lead to diminishment of banana production, a decrease in yields, and economic losses for farmers who are dependent on this crop for their livelihood. Our goal is to understand the potential effects climate change may pose on banana production through the usage of previously measured effects of warming and predictions of temperature change. Some of the keywords that we identified through our research was climate change, bananas, agriculture, Central America, and monoculture. In our introduction, we talked about how climate change is raging worldwide, with the agricultural sector being threatened from a rise in temperature and unexpected weather patterns. We also touched on banana biodiversity, or lack thereof. Banana agriculture primarily runs along the equator, which is a tropical humid region in the world, and it could see a decline with climate change looming. Banana resilience would require a change in venue, water conservation methods, and straying away from the monoculture that they previously are intertwined with. Our study area is Central America. It consists of Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. All of these regions they make up a region called Central America. It's situated between the Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean Sea. It consists of humid swamps, lowlands, and the majority are hilly and mountainous regions. Half the population in Central America lives in rural areas, which leads them to be dependent on agriculturally based incomes. And if not incomes, it's how they make their livelihood, how they feed their families. Central America experiences frequent earthquakes and occasional volcanic eruptions, as they have 40 volcanic cones in this small area of the world. In Central America, tropical rainfalls experienced during the summer months. Their summer months are from May to November, and their drier months are from January to March. The economy in Central America is largely based on exported goods, which is mainly coffee and bananas. They're also known for their corn or maize production, beef, and cotton. Central America today, there's a poor governance and weak political institutions that have led to minimal development in many countries that make up this region. So again, they're extremely dependent on their exported goods. They are vulnerable to fluctuations from other international markets and natural disasters that would gravely impact their GDP. So if like a earthquake hit and they were unable to produce their exported goods, they're taking a large hit that will be felt across their country.
All right, to understand the climate and banana production in Central America, we used a variety of different materials. All were scholarly online databases that included peer-reviewed journals, online simulators, land monitoring services, and an interactive atlas. All of these articles discuss climate change, produce production, and Central America climate change effects. They also talked about species distribution models to manage different species and where they should grow in certain spaces and times. We used the AOGCM, which is the Atmospheric Ocean Global Climate Models, to predict the climate in the future. So on this next slide, we can see the land cover model from Copernicus, who were able to demonstrate what type of land was in Central America. So in that top picture, you can see majority of Central America is either forest or cropland. And this image is back from 2019. And that can help predict where the land cover will be in the future and what type of land cover will be there. In the bottom picture, it is the interactive AR6 Atlas from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. And this shows a warming of 4 degrees Celsius from 1995 to 2014. And in our region of Central America, you can see that there was a decrease in precipitation, which can denote a sort of drought. Overall, all of our materials were aiming to provide historical information on temperatures, precipitation, and growing patterns. They also helped us to predict future climatic changes and monitor any effects that climate change may propose on agriculture. And outside of these materials, we also reached out to some scholars to get their personal standings on this topic.
And then in our results and discussion, we wanted to share that this project taught us a lot over the completion of it. And our goal was not only to educate ourselves, but to educate others, which is why we signed up to do the Student Scholar Day. And this project can teach people how climate change affects agriculture, both crops and farmers. Because as we've covered, climate change will negatively affect the health of crops as they will have lower survival rates, and climate change will also negatively affect farmers' health and well-being, as they will either lose their farms or have to pour all their money into their crops to support bananas in a climate change future. And then this project also taught us how climate change affects regions closer to the equator, as they will experience the most drastic changes of climate change with higher temperatures and more extreme weather patterns. And then some of the challenges that bananas and Central America will face for climate change is that bananas are a monoculture crop currently, and so only one type of this crop gets planted instead of multiple species. This is a problem because if a pest or disease gets introduced into the crop field, it'll wipe out the entire field versus a small portion of it if multiple species were planted in one area. And monoculture crops are also bad for the environment because the soil they get planted in doesn't get the chance to renew the phosphorus and nitrogen in the soil by the next season. That just gets leached away season by season. And then another challenge that Central America faces is that they have a corrupt governmental structure in which their government supports profit over believing in climate change. So they're not going to send aid or seed packets to these farmers. They're probably just going to keep pushing on with the way it is until bananas are no longer existing. And then another challenge that Central America faces is that it's close to the equator, which, as I said, means they will be experiencing the most extreme versions of climate change with higher temperatures, more extreme weather patterns, and more frequent extreme weather patterns. And then some of the solutions that we came up with for the banana problem is that climate smart agriculture, which is a holistic approach to farming that combines traditional farming methods such as crop rotation, community and cultural practices, crop diversity, and it combines those with current scientific innovations such as drip irrigation methods and overloading soil with nitrogen and phosphorus. And then going deeper into some of those traditional methods, crop diversity and crop rotation can fix a few of the issues that bananas present. Doing this can lessen the susceptibility of pests or disease wiping out the entire population. And rotating crops also protects the soil from nutrient leaching, and diversifying banana species is not that hard of a task since it already exists. When you walk into an American grocery store, every single banana is the same size, same color, same shape, but that's not how they exist. Many of them are red or brown or small or spotty, and those just aren't sold in American grocery stores because they don't fit the American banana aesthetic. But in a climate change future, that will have to change. Another solution is the introduction of GMOs into banana crops. Now GMOs already currently exist for bananas, but they will have to be overloaded as bananas will need to sustain the new levels of heat and new precipitation levels. And then the last solution is reducing the effects of climate change itself. This can be done by reducing carbon emissions, reducing our reliance on non-renewable fuel sources, restoring habitats that were destroyed for agricultural purposes, and preserving the natural environment. And all of these are done to keep temperature and precipitation levels at a more reasonable and manageable level, similar to what they currently are.
We did want to touch on some limitations that we found with our research. There is always an uncertainty of the future. All of these models that we use are predictions. We do not know the level and magnitude that climate change will impact the world. We just have educated guesses. And we're also outsiders looking in toward this problem. We felt that as students from an American university, we cannot fully comprehend the repercussions that climate change will have culturally, economically, or politically. However, with the data at hand and the analysis we conducted, we hope to have aided in even a small step towards awareness on this important issue.
So with that all being said, we concluded that there's an urgent need for preemptive measures to ensure that the impacts of climate change don't cease banana production, but to ensure that the development of bananas will survive in the future. Preemptive measures are going to be what's most important in majority of climate change issues, because the sooner that we act upon this issue, the sooner that we can save the species and continue their development throughout the future. We're not entirely sure of what these solutions are and what these preemptive measures are going to be, but they could be a mix of all solutions that Brailee had mentioned earlier. And I'm just going to touch on a few of the communications that we had with outside experts. So I personally talked to Brian Macedonia. He is the CEO and founder of Mac Endeavors. We used one of his articles, Climate Change Driven Shifts in Extent and Location of Areas Suitable for Banana Production, in our paper. And when communicating with him, he said that the current droughts will require irrigation systems and will need principles of permaculture to be incorporated into the systems. Since rainfall is super important for banana production and it currently is given free due to the geographical location of Central America, it will need to continue to increase in the future as we see these changes towards drought. He also suggests that maybe a new geographical location to match weather needs will be necessary. So moving banana production to, say, maybe Texas in the future or some other location might be necessary. And then lastly, he mentioned how GMOs are going to provide different capabilities. Right now we have CRISPR and we're starting to work with different AI technologies, and we need to start to understand how we can manage and work around climate change and alter these species to work with the current climate that is given to us.
And then we also conducted an in-person interview with Dr. Rebecca Williams, who is a professor here at GV. Before she worked here, she was in the Peace Corps in Honduras, and she also did research outside of the Peace Corps, also in Honduras. And she interviewed rural and indigenous farmers in these areas They weren't necessarily banana farmers, but they were farmers dealing with the same problems that banana farmers are going to deal with, and it's in the same geographical location. Some of the solutions that she provided us were the resurgence of traditional agricultural practices, which is supported by the climate smart agricultural approach, which I talked about earlier.
Here are resources. And thank you. Are there any questions?
Well, let's give our speakers a huge round of applause. Many thanks. You have done really wonderful work. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. So we have a few panelists here with us on the screen who would be later presenters. And if any of you has questions to our speakers, you can just unmute your microphone and pop up on the screen and ask question. If you are in the audience, and we have many more people joining us from the audience, and thank you so much for watching this webinar, you can use the Q&A, and I will open the Q&A is open right now. And if you type your question in the Q&A, I will read it, and the speakers also will be able to see it and answer your questions. And finally, if you are watching this presentation later as a recording on YouTube, you can always just email your questions, and I will also convey them to the speakers, but it might take a couple of days to communicate your questions. So if you are here with us online, please just send your questions through the Q&A. And meanwhile, I have a question to you. So of course, this wonderful project, you have developed it in environmental studies and geography for 12, global climate and environmental change. And I was really happy to see how skillfully you have integrated different toolkits and online data that we have been learning and working with through the labs in this class. And you also have really implemented exceptionally well the most loved or hated assignment that I give my students. And this is to reach out to the outside experts. I know that some students are very successful, but some students feel that it's intimidating. So could you please share your experience, how it was for you? You know, obviously you have engaged it with 2 experts in the field, and you conducted interviews, and you used it as a part of your methodology. Was it useful for you? Was it difficult? What is your advice for other students who find sometimes this assignment very difficult?
Yeah, so I personally talked with Brian, and in communications with him, it was just over email, but it was after reading his article and being able to understand what he was trying to convey there, I just wanted to get some more of his like personal opinions and kind of see what he had to say about the topic, like as of now, because the paper was written a few years ago, and as you know, climate change can change so quickly and alter the way that we grow species. So I don't know. It was very cool to talk to him and get to see what he had to say and what his solutions would be if he had the power to make them happen.
And then we also emailed most of the other authors of our scholarly sources, but they were all pretty much based in Central America, and most of our emails were either blocked right away or just never got a response. So in the end, we started thinking about different professors we could interview, and I know we've had Professor Becky Williams in the past, and she has discussed the Peace Corps work in Honduras, and we thought that would be perfect because that is in our study area. And then we had to ask her a few times because she wasn't sure how confident she was about banana farmers, but we assured her that it would all go well and we could just talk about crops in Central America, and then that's where we got most of our solutions from.
Well, wonderful, thank you. Once again, if you are in the audience, please do not hesitate to send your questions through the Q&A. And if any other panelists have questions to our speakers, please, don't hesitate to unmute yourself.
What made you choose the topic of bananas specifically?
So I chose the topic of bananas. I was trying to we were doing like a study group that day, and so we have a few allergies in the room with us. So I was trying to find a recipe that would work, and I was thinking about how, banana bread is so great, love bananas. I was wondering, like, how could our food be impacted? But I did not think the bananas were on the chopping block up until this project. But they are. And I also kind of want to find the other species of bananas out there in the wild just to try them.
Wonderful. I have another question for you. So you have mentioned that there are many solutions. You have explored some of them. There might be some others that we are not aware. You mentioned permaculture as one of them. And of course, banana is produced as monoculture in most places. So what are really the logistics that are needed to move from monoculture to permaculture, how it can be implemented? What other species, what other crops can be successfully combined in those permaculture plantations?
Well, like changing from non-neutral permanent.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of the issues that are like based on the monoculture now is, like I said, like aesthetic purposes, and like these bananas aren't, the other species of bananas aren't so much grown on purpose, but they're kind of like the mess ups of the cookie cutter perfect bananas that we have. And then those are mostly like eaten and sold around Central America for like cheaper. And then so we kind of just need to drop the aesthetic purposes of it and just accept that in a climate change future that we're going to need to have more crop diversity and have more crops, even though they might not look pretty, they taste the exact same. But logistics for farmers, it might be a little difficult because there's pretty much two big banana companies like Dole and Chiquita, and they kind of run everything. So from a banana to change from a monoculture to a permaculture, those companies would have to pass that and supply seeds for that because they kind of rule that whole monopoly.
And companies might not want to step into that territory because they know what they sell currently is going to sell. It's going to go to the stores and it's going to make them money, where they would be taking a gamble on the other versions of bananas. But I mean, if you look at apples, there's like 50 varieties. If Gala isn't out one year, there's going to be a Honeycrisp and they're going to be fine. But branching out and trying something new, a lot of companies won't take that gamble if they know that they won't make a profit.
Excellent answers. Thank you so much. Anybody else has questions here, either in the outer audience or among the panelists? Have perhaps time just for one more question? And this is more not the question, but just the reflection. And I'm sorry for taking you slightly outside of the scope of your question. But we all love banana, right? And it's a very popular crop, but it's also, it's very popular in the Northern Hemisphere, but yet it travels very far away and it travels by plane. And so we know that the carbon footprint, the carbon footprint of food for banana and other tropical crops consumed in the United States or in Europe is pretty high because they have to be transported far away. And of course, the emissions of transportation are contributing to climate change. So what are your thoughts? Do we actually need to eat more banana, or perhaps it's okay to eat more apples if we're in Michigan and they're produced locally? Again, I'm taking you really outside of the goals of your project. I know that your project is more focusing on production rather than transportation and distribution, but I'm just curious, what are your thoughts about carbon footprint of our food transportation? And again, this is a question to you, but also if other panelists have any comments, please do go ahead.
Let's talk about emissions. The highest emissions in banana growth are in their transportation sector. So like they've done studies, they've looked at where their emissions are the highest, and it's literally just transportation.
Because currently in Central America, rainfall is naturally provided. They don't have to do any sort of irrigation systems. And I think as far as transportation, it is a far ways and it is a large carbon footprint that they do put on the planet. But with these sort of GMO developments that we were talking about, if we are starting to incorporate different ways of growing bananas and having them grow in different climatic situations, and maybe we could even start growing them in the northern hemisphere and the Central America or Northern America, and that could totally change the way that it has a footprint on.
Yeah, and GMOs are kind of like a personal controversy too. So people that don't want to eat GMOs already should not be eating bananas. They should eat fruits and vegetables that are in season, close to them geographically, because it's not traveling. Because for any tropical fruit or any food to travel a long distance, it needs to have a freshness GMO component to it so that it can travel those days. So yeah, if people are worried about the GMO aspect, just eat locally grown seasonal food. But yeah, that doesn't necessarily stop the carbon emissions.
Thank you so much. Once again, many thanks for your outstanding presentation. Let's give another round of applause to our presenters, and you feel free to stay for the rest of the session or leave if you need to go for the other class. You'll just need to mute yourself for the next session and stop sharing your screen. We will move right away to the next presentation by Claire and Chris that starts at 10:30. So we have right now 3 minutes for a tiny transitional break. Well, and welcome back. So this was really an excellent presentation. And now we are moving to another excellent presentation in ANS and GPY for 12, Global Climate and Environmental Change. And this presentation is by Christopher, Claire, and Stephanie. And I understand that Christopher and Claire are our presenters. So welcome. Tell us more about your research. Please introduce yourself, and we are all ears.
All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Christopher Kotkowicz. I am presenting with Claire Samberg today. This is our presentation on climate change's impacts on the Australian coral reefs by myself, Claire, and then another group mate, Stephanie. And so we can get this started for you today. Next slide, please. Maybe some technical issues. Just a second.
Do you have any difficulty with moving forward with the next slide?
Yeah, Claire's sharing the screen. I'm not sure if she's having some issues.
Yeah, it wouldn't let me unmute, and it made me get out of Zoom really quick. Let me share that again. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay.
You can just share your screen. It's a green button at the bottom.
All right. You guys see my screen?
I think it's loading. Yes, now it starts showing up.
Perfect. All right, so we're going to be talking about climate change's impact on the Australian reefs. My name is Claire Samberg.
All right, yep. And I'm Christopher. And then our other group mate, Stephanie. She can't be here today, but she's recorded a couple of her slides, so we're gonna play those for you. as well. All right, so a little bit of background to cover our abstract and stuff. So climate change has created challenges not for humanity, but the entire natural world as we know it. That's really not a surprise to anybody who's even looked at what's happening in the news with climate change. I mean, we see impacts everywhere from global warming to higher sea temperatures to land cover change, and it all comes back to climate change, which we contribute to a lot as humans, which makes sense as we call it climate change. So this research focuses on the impacts of the coral reefs in Australia and how climate change has impacted them specifically. We chose this area because the Great Barrier Reef is there. It's the largest surface reef in the world, and it's often looked to during times of change and issue to see what's happening there to kind of get a clue to what's going to happen in other places. So a couple of our keywords within our presentation are ocean acidification, climate change, the Great Barrier Reef itself, Australia, and then coral reefs. All right, so a little bit of an introduction here. So our objective through this research project is to identify the dangers related to coral reefs and figure out how to reduce these environmental impacts. There's obviously more than one, danger to coral reefs and everything else that's going on. It's just not just one localized thing. There's a variety of things happening. So we want to determine which of these impacts have the greatest impact and how can we reduce them. Well, while there are several impacts, there are some that cause more damage and cause more issue and cause more harm than others. And so it makes sense that those would be the impacts to focus conservation efforts and recovery efforts on in order to get those down to then focus on some, maybe less harmful impacts. So the loss of coral reefs not only diminishes the biodiversity and ecological services they provide, but also impacts the livelihoods of millions of people who rely on them for tourism, fisheries, and coastal protection. Yeah, reefs don't only help the natural world, but they help people a lot, especially from, storm protection. And they stop coastal erosion because they do slow down quite a bit of wave speed, and flooding from tropical storms and hurricanes is also diminished by reefs across the world. So they do provide critical protections for people. So addressing climate change through mitigation and adaptation measures is crucial to safeguarding the future of Australia's coral reefs and the ecosystems they support, and not only Australia's coral reefs, but coral reefs throughout the entire world, because climate change affects all of them, but it affects bigger reefs more noticeably at first. All right, so our methodology. Our first thing to do was think about, well, we don't live, in Australia. We don't have firsthand experience. So what should we do? Well, the first thing we thought was to find research papers on issue that coral reefs are facing, to find papers from written professionals who have lived there, studied there, been there, and observed really what's changing and what's going on, in Australia. We also used digital softwares to model climate change on the Great Barrier Reef. This is IPCC softwares and other stuff that high panels use in order to determine changes. And that makes sense. I mean, we want reliable quality, modules to use, and these softwares provide that. And then we're able to look through and see, okay, where is the greatest change with this scenario? Where is the greatest change with this scenario? And so we find differences in each scenario, and then we can kind of start circling in on one that says, hey, this would probably give us the greatest outcome, but we're going to keep, looking through other ones. And so we also contacted many experts in this field. We reached out to them and said, hey, you guys wrote these papers. You've, either lived there or studied there, and you've gathered all this information. What do you guys think about this? So that's part of our methodology.
The area of study is the Australian coral reefs, heavily focusing on the Great Barrier Reef, located on the northeast coast of Australia. Looking at the picture, we can get a better understanding of the location of the Great Barrier Reef.
All right, so elevated sea surface temperature. So what is that? It's exactly what it sounds like. On average, sea surface temperatures are rising. So what does this do? Well, climate change is obviously warming the world, and it's also warming the seas. So what does this mean for marine life, specifically corals? Well, all marine life is going to have to adapt and change. But one of the biggest things is when the sea surface temperature on average is continuing to elevate. That means as you get a little bit further down and a little bit further down, that water itself is also going to start warming, right? Which makes sense. Heat up and it goes down. So specifically corals have many issues when, water temperatures fluctuate a lot. They like a very stable climate. So they might have to evolve a higher heat tolerance. They may be forced to move. They may be forced to find different areas, and they may die as well. So these are all possible outcomes for corals, and this is kind of one of the biggest problems that they face, because it leads to so many other issues for them. All right, so coral bleaching. What is coral bleaching? Coral bleaching is when coral expel zooxanthellae. Those are the symbiotic algae that they feed with, and then what gives them their color. So you can see on the top there's a nice vibrant orange piece of coral, and then on the bottom there's the very ghosted bleached coral. So what causes corals to bleach is when they expel those zooxanthellae, and that could be for any number of reasons that stress them out, whether that be high water temperatures, pollution, and things like that. So are corals dead when they bleach? They're not dead immediately, but they can only stay bleached for about a couple weeks at most if they're lucky, and they can die very quickly. Even after a bleaching event has occurred, if those zooxanthellae come back, corals are still very susceptible to disease. It's harder for them to reproduce, and it's just harder for them to exist, and that compounds with each bleaching event, which is why it's such a great concern that we're seeing higher bleaching events, because, like I said earlier, it compounds here, and then they end up with even worse issues than they did the first bleaching event.
Ocean acidification. One fact that I found while doing my research was the ocean absorbs 1/4 of the carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere by human activities. Now, what is ocean acidification, and how does it affect coral reef? It is the process in which seawater becomes more acidic because of the excess carbon dioxide. The overall process lowers the carbonate ion concentration. Carbonate ions is needed for coral reefs to build their skeleton structure. Now, if we look at these figures, the one on the right, that is a coral reef, is split in half, as you can see. And the left side of the picture, it shows a healthy coral reef, and the right side of the picture, it shows a weak coral reef that has underwent this process and is in a acidic pH level that it's not able to get enough carbonate ions, and it's weak. Then the figure on the left right here is just a breakdown of the process of ocean acidification. Looking at these two maps, we can look further into the pH of the ocean surrounding Australia. Looking at the map on the left, we can see that the northern ocean surrounding Australia has a lower pH than the southern ocean surrounding Australia. Then looking at the map on the right, is the average pH surface water between 1870 and 1890 and 2000 and 2009. We can see throughout this time that the pH has gone down, and continuing to have this high amount of carbon dioxide and the ocean taking in this carbon dioxide, we can see that the water is going to continue to become acidic, and these numbers to drop even more as they are. Pollutions. Pollutions that originate on land but often find their way into coastal waters include sediments, nutrients, pathogens, pesticides, trash, and microplastics. Sediments are known to be the primary stressor for coral reefs. Sediments smother coral reefs and interfere with their ability to feed, grow, and reproduce. And on this top left picture, you can see a coral reef that actually has sediment on top of it. A high level of nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus can lead to the growth of algae that blocks sunlight. And one fact that I found while doing my research.
Okay, yeah, sorry. I was reading or listening to it today, and I don't know why it's pausing, but basically she just talks about how starfish are a native species that are invasive to coral reef and will eat away at the symbiotic algae. Going into the direct anthropogenic or human-induced damages, one of the main things when we think about, coral bleaching or ocean acidification is it's caused by climate change, which some of it's natural, but most of it obviously has been proven to be human-induced. So post-industrial revolution, the increase of greenhouse gas emissions has been adding up in our atmosphere. And then in Stephanie's slide, you saw that little visual where it was the CO2 emissions are being absorbed by the ocean, heating it up and making the pH levels more acidic. And so that causes the coral to get into a stress state, and it then releases expels its symbiotic algae, resulting in the coral bleaching, making them, more vulnerable to diseases and mortality. Another anthropogenic damage is overfishing. So the removal of certain fish species in these oceans will disrupt the ecological balance, which then leads to algal overgrowth, which smothers the coral reefs and doesn't allow them to fully function. And then pollution, or actually I wanted to add with the picture in the slide, another issue with overfishing is the term bottom trawling, which is a form of fishing for collecting crabs and other bottom fish on like the bottom of the ocean. And basically it's just dragging along the ocean floor collecting those. So as it's doing that, it's also, breaking apart coral and damaging it. And then pollution, there's land occurrences such as agricultural runoff, industrial activities, and coastal development like resort construction or building houses on the side of the ocean front. So those harsh substances that are being used in those practices will, if they enter the waterways, they will degrade the water quality, hampering the coral growth and reproduction. So mitigating climate change and solutions requires collaborative efforts at a global, national, and local scale. Some of the key actions to mitigate climate change and help preserve the coral reefs includes transitioning to renewable energy, just because, as I just talked about, climate change and the increase of greenhouse gases is what's causing the ocean level or ocean temperatures to increase and harm the coral reefs. So in one of my classes, we're talking about different forms of renewable energy. So two of the I believe would be the best forms of renewable for our study area include tidal energy, which is the bottom picture. They're underneath the ocean using the tide and the current of the ocean to generate energy, or above is the offshore wind turbines. So these would just be, good alternatives for Australia just because they are surrounded by ocean. And there are people who live in Australia that don't want to see it as much, they can use these alternatives. And then you can also do sustainable land use practices. So adopting sustainable agriculture practices and promoting land management is another way to ensure there's no pollution entering our waterways. To ensure their survival, adaptation strategies are essential for the coral reef's continuation. So practices such as reef restoration, so coral gardening, and I don't know if you guys have seen the artificial structures that are being made in the oceans. They're not the most natural, but at this point of, this point of like the climate change clock, a lot of these coral structures won't be able to rejuvenate by themselves. So, if we cause this, it's our responsibility to then monitor these reefs. So using those like artificial reefs has been a great way to adapt to climate change. In addition, there's, marine protected areas. So implementing regulations to, protect the reefs and reduce stressors such as overfishing and pollution is a great alternative. So by implementing and using these strategies, we can enhance the resilience of coral reefs in the face of these environmental challenges. And then throughout each lab, we've been able to use a few of the softwares that we've done in the labs for our study area. So you can see the top one is the IPCC. So we were able to look at the temperature of the ocean with the increase of global temperature change. So that's 3 degrees Celsius. You can see that the level or the temperatures of the ocean are increasing with that. And then the bottom one is the Copernicus, which didn't really let us see much about changes in the ocean, but we could see that along where the Great Barrier Reef is, the border of Australia is very forested, so that helps us ensure that there's not as much pollution that's coming in from land, just because it is all natural area and not as much like industrial stuff. Just won't let me go forward, it'll let me go back. Let me just, sorry about that.
You know, you can try just to reshare it again, the next slide, and go from there. And I think you are very close to your conclusion, so you probably can also verbalize it, but no worries. That's technology.
Sorry, yeah, I'll just talk about basically for our conclusion. Throughout this course, we've, delved deeper into climate change. And from my perspective before this course, really, I just knew mainly about what climate change was and how it's caused. But from this course now, we've learned a lot about climatic variability and change in the past, present, and future. Obviously, we've learned more about how to use climate simulations and climate modeling softwares to simulate global environmental change. And we've also learned interactions between human vulnerability and adaptations to global environmental change. And then through talking with experts and stuff, we've been able to get more awareness of emerging research and where to find that research. And then with our project specifically, we've learned how detrimental climate change is to the coral reefs and solutions we can implement to lessen these effects of ocean acidification and coral bleaching.
Yep, and then just the last couple points and then for time for questions. So our discussion kind of ends up with climate change must be stopped to save native corals, or it must be limited in some form or capacity. The goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius or less is a good goal, but even more than that may have to be done. This is essentially a non-negotiable point, because if we continue with too much ocean acidification and too much ocean warming, we're going to lose our native coral species. So could we genetically modify corals in the future? That's a question, and they're not native and they're not, like the natural world, how we'd see it, but could we create corals with different, skeletal systems so they're more resistant to ocean acidification? Can we create corals genetically with a higher heat tolerance? Those are, possibilities and stuff we've done with other animals and other organisms. So maybe that's an option for us. And then maybe AI could even help us in the future trying to decipher some problems. So that could be a distinct possibility. So that wraps up our presentation. If there's any questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
Well, thank you so much. Let's start by the round of applause. Again, great work. And sorry for some technology issues, but it looks like you saved the end of your presentation very well. You can obviously see that you know your project very, very well, and you became knowledgeable experts. So I have a quick question to you, again, to inspire other students who are sometimes scared to talk to experts outside of our classes on campus. Share the secret of your success. Obviously, you were very productive. You had many conversations with with experts in Australia and all over the world. So what would you tell other students about this assignment and how to make it efficient?
Yeah, sure. Claire, would you like to go first, or would you like me to go first?
I was gonna say, I feel like you have the best expert connection. I emailed a few of the authors from the articles that we read and used for research, but a lot of them were busy in their research and only sent me links or resources. But I think your connection is a really good example of good experts.
Yeah,
solutions.
so kind of like what Claire was saying, with a couple people, you'll end up, just getting emails for links and stuff like that. Because they are doing research and they are quite busy. They might not have enough time to sit down and talk for you. But one of my professors that I had a entry level bio class last year, and I worked with him over the summer at the Annis Water Resources Institute. And he lived in Australia for a couple months, and that's like his thing is oceanography and climatology. So he looked into corals, he studied them, he's even got some up at Annis at his lab. So it was pretty cool to talk to him about it because he's super passionate about it and he was super excited. And he, was like, here's all this research. If you need more, let me know. And I'm like, oh, cool. He's like, so yeah, here's all these like topics that, people haven't considered and stuff like this. Like, what about deep water corals and other corals just like coming in and taking over? Are those possibilities and stuff? But my biggest recommendation is to just ask people. I mean, you're never gonna know unless you try. Nobody's ever gonna give you a really nasty email and say like, oh, get out of my face and stuff. Nobody's gonna do that to you. So just ask people, because you're either gonna get something super useful or something kind of useful. And if you don't, I mean, at least you tried. So that's my advice to it.
Excellent. And I know, Chris, that you have to run to your next presentation to present your poster. So just a very, very quick question to you both, and maybe Claire will take it if Chris needs to run. Obviously, you put lots of thought not only into climate change mitigation measures for Australia, but also for specific adaptation and especially coral restoration techniques. What are really the most promising? Like what can we do to save our corals, at least partially?
Yeah, I think when I was talking about the adaptations and solutions, there's a really wide range of what we can do. Renewable energy obviously would help with climate change as a whole, but if you were wanting to worry more about the adaptations for how we can preserve coral reefs, definitely the coral gardening and the like artificial coral reefs that have been marine biologists and other volunteers have been working at creating are definitely an immediate action that we can take now to help them. But just for the long run, I mentioned renewable energy because we're already working towards that anyway to help climate change as a whole. But yeah, definitely for immediate work, I would say the coral gardening and artificial reefs.
Yeah, and I would agree with Claire. I think we have to help them in some form. I don't know. I've questioned moving corals around. That was something I had talked with my other professor about. He's like, well, there's surface type corals like we see on surface reefs, but then there's deep water corals that are down a couple thousand feet. So he had potentially talked about if those corals could move, and if there's a big dependence on having specifically native corals there, or if it's just do we need a reef of some sort. But I would agree that essentially we need to help garden corals and stuff like that for a while. I would think it would make sense at some point to maybe genetically modify a few and try that somewhere to see what would happen, to see if we could give them more heat resistant. Or what we might just see naturally is they start to evolve more of a heat resistance, and we see heat resistant corals start to take over and dominate a bit more. So.
Well, thank you again. One more, huge uploads to you. Congratulations on your excellent work. Good luck with your next presentation. You are superheroes presenting multiple papers at the Student Scholar Day. For those of you who are just joining this symposium, please remember that we are using Q&A today just because there is a big online audience, so you wouldn't be able to vocalize your question, but you can always send your question or comment through the Q&A, and we will be transiting in a couple of minutes to our next group of speakers at 11 o'clock. And meanwhile, we're just going to take a 3-minute break. If there are meanwhile any questions or comments, you can always send them through our Q&A or through chat. And so welcome back, and we are getting ready now for our third presentation by Kate, Carron, and Bushra Rashrash, who are already here ready to present. So just a quick introduction. Kate and Bushra worked with me on 2 projects, and their presentations will be back to back. The first presentation, Equity and Inclusion in Climate Action and Adaptation Plans in Michigan Cities, has been supported by our Marby Fellowship from Johnson Center for Philanthropy, and they are one of the 2 cohorts of students who have been working on this project since the past year. Some of you probably watched last year the presentation by Kate Pointer and Hannah Zillman. Their presentation is also available on the GVSU CCS website, so you can kind of go back and see what was the status of this research exactly a year ago when Kate Pointer and Hannah Zillman presented their preliminary findings at the Student Scholar Day 27. Now we are in 2024 with the 28th Student Scholar Day, and so Kate and Bushra are follow up on this research and adding significantly more information that they're going to share with you today. And then they will present another paper at 11:30, and I will introduce it at that time. So Kate and Bushra, welcome. Thank you for sharing your screen and being ready. The floor is yours, and looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. So this is the Equity and Inclusion and Climate Action and Adaptation Plans in Michigan Cities by me, Bushra, and Kate, with the mentorship of Dr. Elena. So a little bit of a background on what this study went over. This study extended the previous year's research to examine some of the integration of equity and inclusion in Michigan cities and their climate strategies. There was an overall aim to enhance future climate plans with diverse knowledge for equitable and inclusive action as well. The foundational work was created as a key framework to assess diverse stakeholder involvement and included some Indigenous and other marginalized and vulnerable groups in climate planning. And through analyzing some of the city plans and some of the city planners and stakeholder interviews, we seek to inform some of the evolution of a well-rounded climate adaptation strategy for potential application for the future. So what we did was we analyzed the climate action and the adaptation plans in Michigan. Some of these were the diversity and inclusion efforts, the equitable actions, and the climate action and adaptation planning. And we also evaluated some of the integration of indigenous knowledge in climate action and adaptation planning, looking at inclusion of tribal partners, any acknowledgement of indigenous knowledge, and some of the strategies and their equivalents as well. Our 2 overall research questions were how the consideration of equity and justice and climate action and climate adaptation goals of existing and any development plans are related to diversity and inclusion of stakeholders. And the second one was how the 2I seeing approach reflected in the tribal climate adaptation menu that was released in 2020, how it could potentially inform and improve the existing and future climate adaptation planning tools, which currently fail to address the unique needs, values, and cultures of Indigenous communities. Some of the objectives of this research were to develop an analytical framework for assessing and comparing the consideration of equity in climate action and adaptation plans. We also wanted to evaluate and compare some of the diversity of various groups of stakeholders that were engaged in the development and implementation process of some of the climate action and adaptation plans. We also wanted to learn what some of the opportunities and the challenges were, and these were including, but they were not limited to, things like funding support and impacts on diversity, equity, and inclusion and climate action adaptation planning. And we also wanted to evaluate and look at how the 2-eyed seeing approach could potentially help to improve some of the existing and working climate planning. In terms of the climate action and adaptation plans of Michigan cities, this is a map that shows some of the ones that we evaluated, which included Marquette, Traverse City. We can see East Lansing, Ann Arbor, Detroit as well. For Ann Arbor, they had released their plan in 2020. For Detroit, it was in 2017. East Lansing, 2012. Grand Rapids has not released one yet, but it is expected to be released in 2024. Marquette was released in 2013. Royal Oak 2022, and then we can see Traverse City had a mitigation plan 2011 and then an adaptation plan in 2015 that was released. The system that we used, we looked at 9 different city plans from 7 different cities, and our grading system included 2 grading criteria, which were equity-centered actions and diversity inclusion, and they were 5-tiered. Some of the sectors and stakeholders. For our sectors, we had 14, and some of them were emergency management, housing security, food security. We looked at also some of the access to urban green infrastructure, health and wellness, air quality, waste management, business and economic activity, and etc. Some of these stakeholders, we had 12 in total. We looked at K-12, colleges and universities, environmental advocacy groups. We also looked at citizen science groups and clubs, any city planning and services, state agencies, any private firms and consultants, etc. This is our 5-tiered grading system. You can see that the equity-centered actions, we went from 0 to 4. 0 is where we have evaluated that the planning domain is absent. 1, planning domain is present, but it doesn't really address any equity measures. 2, it's present, equity is mentioned as a goal, but the strategy for achieving it have not been explained. 3 is it's present, the strategies for achieving equity are explained. And 4 is that it's present, the strategies are explained, and the evaluation plan is also provided. For the diversity inclusion, same thing, it's 5-tiered. 0 is there is none. 1, there are participants, like attending community meetings, participated in surveys or interviews, recognizing in the plan. 2, content co-creators. 3, collaborators. And 4, as authors or co-authors, where we can see them listed on the cover page as well. This is an assessment comparison for the equity-centered actions of city plans, as well as the diversity inclusion of city plans. These are our 7 cities: Detroit, Traverse City, Ann Arbor, Royal Oak, Marquette, East Lansing, and the Traverse City CAP. We can see that for Ann Arbor, it had a higher percentage in its evaluation within the equity-centered actions of city plans. And you can see the same thing for it in the diversity inclusion of city plans as well. And we can see Detroit had a similarly high score as well. East Lansing seemed to be the lowest for diversity inclusion. And then for equity-centered actions of city plans, Marquette and Traverse City CAP were the lowest as well.
And then using that grading rubric, we went ahead and graded all of the different city plans. And the purpose of this was to show where each city is succeeding and also where it could also use some improvement. So this was Traverse City. The other plan they had, Marquette. And then Ann Arbor, we found that Ann Arbor had the highest scores. East Lansing, Royal Oak. And we also looked at the publication year in relation to diversity and equity. And as you can see, the more recent the plan was, the more likely it was to include diversity and equity in the plan. And Ann Arbor had the most information involving diversity and equity. We also looked at the different funding sources for these adaptation plans. And last year, there were surveys sent out to assess the different types of funding received for these plans. And so this is where that data is from. However, there was low participation in those surveys. So to follow up with that, this year we reached out to different professionals and supplemented with a total of 5 interviews to get more information about where the funding is coming from. And then we went ahead and created this table from the interviews. And there were 5 different participants, and some main categories we looked at were equity consideration, collaboration across different sectors, inclusion of stakeholders, funding sources, and then also specific activities along with the goals they have. And some common themes we had and both of these were from the Grand Rapids Plan and the Ann Arbor Plan, which are both unpublished currently. And both Grand Rapids and Ann Arbor plans included equity in both of their plans. And additionally, both plans had collaboration across multiple sectors. So for example, in Ann Arbor's plan, they had a focus on connecting housing to mobility and also development of warming and cooling centers. And they both made big efforts to include diverse voices within the stakeholders. And for funding, common places where they received funding were public and private foundations, grants, as well as philanthropic foundations as well. So some goals that were a common theme across both Grand Rapids and Ann Arbor's unpublished plans were sustainability, decarbonization, and energy efficiency. We also looked at this tribal adaptation menu. So the link here is so you can visit the website and also look at the menu for yourself. And this piece was designed to represent Ojibwe clans in their role in caring about the earth. The turtle in the center is a representation of Turtle Island, which is our lands, waters, and home. The red line connects the hearts through minds of the beings on earth, through their feet and into the ground. And these bloodlines show how we are made up of everything, and also how our thoughts, intentions, and actions impact the place we call home. And there are 4 basic colors. The dark blue represents the water, light blue, the skies. The green is the plant life, and the red is the blood and the earth. So we created this table showing the number of city plans we reviewed that included the tribal framework and stakeholders that addressed these tribal frameworks and knowledges. And as you can see, many of the city plans did not include this knowledge. And we believe that a 2I approach should be taken for future plans. So this would mean combining both Western knowledge and Indigenous knowledge. And the screen for climate adaptation plans should be based on acknowledgement of this Indigenous knowledge as well. There were some limitations to our research, and these included a small sample of climate adaptation plans. There were only 7. There was a broad chronological range. So the plans were published from anywhere from 2011 all the way to 2024. And there was also quite a low response to our survey, along with small number of subjects in our interviews, only 5. And the number of groups of stakeholders is used as a proxy of demographic diversity. And the ratings of considerations for equity and diversity are based on interpretation of plans and other documents. Lastly, our nature of climate action and adaptation planning is constantly evolving.
So we had 4 overarching conclusion and conclusionary statements. One was that we wanted to raise awareness for inclusive climate strategies that reflect a diverse, historically underrepresented perspective and ensure that there were to be equitable community representation. We also wanted to establish a foundation for future climate action plans by fostering collaboration among various stakeholders and merging Indigenous knowledge like the Tribal Menu Plan with scientific research to develop any impactful and encompassing strategies for climate change. The reviewed climate action and adaptation plans also offer insights on critical improvement areas, and they also highlight the ongoing need to integrate any diverse perspectives. And the climate action and adaptation planning hinge on integrating equity at all stages and need to foster cross-sector collaboration and actively involve diverse community stakeholders in their planning process as well. this is our bibliography. And then that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, congratulations on your excellent presentation. So let's give our speakers a huge round of applause. Thank you. And once again, if you are watching this webinar online right now, and if you are with us in the synchronous online space and you want to ask any questions, please do send your questions through the Q&A. You will not be able to vocalize them. You will not be able to send them through the chat, but there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And of course, if you are watching this presentation later on YouTube as a recording, you can always send your questions through email to GVSU Climate Change Education Solutions Network, and we will convey your questions through email to our speakers. So Kate and Carron, meanwhile, I am going to ask you a couple of questions. Of course, we have also some panelists from this session. Claire, Sophia, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to unmute yourself and ask your questions as well. So my first question to you, Kate and Bushra, is what were perhaps the most exciting and the most rewarding elements of this research project? And also, what was the most challenging part of this project as well? So you have been working on this since fall semester. You have learned a lot. So tell us a little bit more about your experience.
For me, the most exciting parts were the interviews because it was really interesting to see those climate adaptation planners and the work they do and how passionate they are about what they do, as well as the community members that we interviewed too, and just seeing their involvement and wanting to see their city become more sustainable. And it was just really cool to see their passions. I would say the most difficult part was probably coordinating those interviews, finding participants, and then finding times that worked for all of us.
Thank you. And what about you, Bushra?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the most difficult parts of this research was to remain subjective throughout the analysis process, whether that was for the interviews or reading through the climate adaptation plans. Again, obviously there will always be bias, but throughout that process, it was a little bit difficult to, even though we were the ones to conduct the interviews ourselves, we had to make sure to remove ourselves from whenever we were analyzing the interview transcripts, because while we were there and we understood what they meant, but that could also be influenced by our own bias and our own belief systems. So that was a little bit difficult when we wanted to analyze the interviews and the results, just so that we try to maintain a non-biased approach. But again, that's a little bit difficult because it was a little bit more of a qualitative research, as well as there was an acknowledgement across all 5 participants that although they wanted to include and involve different stakeholders and different groups and to be able to apply equitable goals, it was hard because they did lack sufficient funding and sufficient personnel, which made it not impossible, but very difficult to include some of the grading rubrics that we included when we were grading their plans. Some of the goals that we outlined, they weren't able to have just because they did have insufficient funding or they did not have enough personnel to be able to achieve those. So they could only do with the amount that they had proposed in their plans.
Okay. Any other questions from the panelists? Meanwhile, when you're all preparing your questions, I have another question for you. So your research was supported by the Johnson Center for Philanthropy, and they will continue supporting other students' projects. So what is your advice perhaps for other students? By the way, I just wanted to clarify that the Mobby Fellowship is available for any faculty at Grand Valley in any discipline to support research with 2 undergraduate students on any topic within their discipline, which is related to philanthropy. So in our project, there was this connection to the philanthropy in terms of our intention to understand better the needs of cities. And the needs of all municipalities in Michigan, and perhaps also at a broader scale, and understand how philanthropic community could support those efforts and where are the greatest needs. So what did you find from this project? Where do you see, where are the greatest needs? You just mentioned that some, that cities want to integrate goals related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but sometimes it's just difficult because of the staffing limitations or funding limitations. What would you recommend to philanthropic community and to the Johnson Center in connecting those resources to where is the greatest need?
I recommend probably trying to just spread awareness of what exactly they're trying to do, because I know a lot of people aren't aware of like these climate adaptation plans that are occurring. So if you just spread more information, get more people involved, and hopefully more people would want to donate and support the good causes that they want to achieve.
I agree as well. One common theme was that a lot of these adaptation plans were supported by government funds. So this is state or federal, which is also a reason why it was hard for them to include or integrate some of those other related goals to equity and diverse stakeholdership, just because the process of applying for those grants and those funds is a tedious and long process and takes a very long time. And there is a definite lack of access and a barrier to access to be able to have access to those funds. So I think the philanthropic community, definitely, I think there should be a need for an explanation of what some of these city plans and climate adaptation plans are, what they mean, and what they could do for the communities, and as well as what that money could help start in terms of programming to assist or to address some of the issues within the community in relation to climate adaptation and planning.
Well, thank you for this excellent answers. And one more question to you both, just more of a reflection for the potential of the two eyes seeing approach. So we obviously saw that the Tribal Climate Adaptation Menu was published in 2020. It builds on another climate adaptation document released by Intertribal Council in 2016. We also saw that some of the plans that we examined were published earlier. For example, Marquette was published in 2013. Traverse City was published in 2011, before these documents became available. But still, these communities live side by side, and obviously, the indigenous people are among us, and all the cities are built on the indigenous land. So even, setting apart this specific recommendation of climate mitigation, climate adaptation menu, what do you see as the main barriers? Why cities, we clearly saw that even though there are some strategies that resonate between the strategies formulated in the menu and the strategies that are adopted by the cities, there is really no evidence of communication. We almost see that cities function in their own vacuum, and they don't necessarily reach out to the tribes, and they do not reach out to tribal experts, even though this knowledge is available. What do you think are the major challenges, and how we can overcome them? What is the barrier for, what are the major barriers that you see for cities in integrating indigenous and traditional knowledge? And, if you have any thoughts on how cities can work better in this area.
I think that once again, kind of like I mentioned earlier, that awareness is definitely a problem. Many people are just not aware of the tribal plans. So I think they would be able to work together and become aware of this and try to collaborate, and like you mentioned, see that they do have very similar common goals, and together I think it would help achieve those goals much more efficiently.
As Oh, yeah, I just wanted to continue a little bit. I think that one of the reasons why there is such a large barrier is because I think historically we know that Indigenous communities have long been marginalized and excluded from any decision-making process that is regarding any land use and management. So I think in terms of integrating into Indigenous knowledge or including tribes or any Indigenous knowledge in any of these plans, I think there's a lack of trust between any city and any governmental authorities and tribes and Indigenous communities. So I think once that is fostered and that trust and that relationship is built on mutual respect and understanding, then I think that facilitation process of including those Indigenous knowledge in the climate action and adaptation planning would facilitate a little bit better. And I think to me that it probably is one of the largest barriers, just that lack of trust.
Thank you again. Thank you for this great reflections. Thank you for the excellent presentation. Once again, if anybody has any last moment questions or comments from the audience or from the panel, please feel free to voice. I think we have time probably for one more or a couple of questions, and then we will be transitioning to the next presentation, also by Kate and Bushra at 11:30. This will be completely different project that they worked on this summer. So once again, if there are any questions about climate change mitigation and adaptation plans, please do voice them right now. Otherwise, we will go into 2-minute break before the next presentation. Well, thank you all, and we just have 1 second to breathe and move to the next PowerPoint. Well, welcome back, and we are ready for the 4th presentation of this virtual Climate Change Student Symposium at GVSU Student Scholar Day. And we are continuing with another presentation by Kate and Bushra. And this time they're going to share their research on relationships between happiness, sustainability, access to green infrastructure, and land ethics. And this project is really primarily focusing on development of methodology for exploring this very, very complex relationship between human happiness, sustainability, access to green spaces, and our cultural beliefs. And they started this project working with me this summer with support of the grant from the Office of Undergraduate Research and Scholarship. So welcome back, Kate and Bushra, and I'm ready for your slides being shared and looking forward for your presentation.
All right, are you able to see my screen? Okay, so a search for happiness through connection with environment and sustainability, a pilot study. So the relationship between human happiness and environmental sustainability has been debated since the 19th century. There has been prevailing assumption of agreement of the literature that suggests that human happiness and environmental sustainability go hand in hand. However, there is a disagreement that is increasing by the human transgression of biocapacity of the Earth and inequality gap between the global North and the global South. We focused on 3 big questions, which were: how are the relationships between environmental and sustainability and human happiness shaped by environmental ethics? How do societal views of nature and attitudes toward sustainability influence individual and community well-being? And to what extent is human happiness compatible with sustainable living? If it is, how could it inform pathways for societal transformation towards a more equitable and bearable future for everyone? Our hypothesis is that there is a positive correlation between individual happiness and community sustainability is present in subjects with strong pro-environmental ethics, connection with nature, and positive attitudes towards sustainability. We had 2 main objectives. which were to develop qualitative and quantitative methods for exploring relationships between environmental sustainability, happiness, well-being, and prevailing ethical beliefs about nature applicable in future studies. The second objective was to generate preliminary insights on the happiness, ethics, sustainability nexus based on a small community scale data set, including transcribed interviews and surveys supplemented by bibliographic data and field observation of access to nature. So some definitions, just for some clarification. We defined happiness as the experience of joy, contentment, or positive well-being combined with a sense that life is good, meaningful, and worthwhile. Sustainability can be defined as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Systems refers to the benefits that human populations derive from ecosystems. And land ethics can be defined as it expands the definition of community to include not only humans, but also all the other parts of the earth as well. So this includes soils, water, plants, and animals. We also created this image as a framework for our research. And happiness can be defined and understood in many different ways. It can be different for both the community and the individual. There are also different types of happiness as well. Hedonic is more of your own pleasurable experiences, while eudaimonic is more about serving others, and it achieves happiness through experiences of meaning and purpose. And in Western cultures, there is more of a emphasis on hedonic, so more of the pursuit of pleasure, while in Eastern and Indigenous cultures, the eudaimonic emphasis is more on balance and harmony. There's also a significant body of knowledge in the literature that shows that happiness is related to health and well-being, and that is linked to the ecosystem services, which you can see in the green bulb on the right. Ecosystem services can be created in 4 different subgroups, as you can see in this image as well. So provisional services really includes food, water, fiber, etc. The regulating services include our climate, the hydrological cycle. The cultural services can be more like meditation, prayer, exercise, and supporting services is like landforms and how the ground provides foundation. And then moving over to the left side of this image, there is also a significant body of literature that involves attitude towards the environment. And so some of these attitudes include egotistic, which is pursuit of happiness, not really thinking of others, altruistic, which is serving society, and biospheric, which is care for the environment. And we wanted to investigate how these ethical structures are related to happiness and how these land ethics influence how people think about sustainability. So to do this, we conducted some surveys. We had a primary data collection involved in surveys of a park business in Georgetown Township, Michigan. We went to the Grand Ravines Park, which is located in Ottawa County. The surveys were given through the Qualtrics platform, and we just had a QR code, and we had the participants scan the QR code, and then they were able to fill out the survey on their phone. And since this research involved human subjects, we did receive approval from the IRB prior to this research. And participants were asked to rank different statements. They were based on topics pertaining to individual happiness and also their attitudes towards sustainability. So this was the park we went to, and one specific part of the park we went to was the dog park. We also conducted interviews in addition to the surveys. We held 11 interviews with environmental experts and educators. They were recruited via email invitation sent to over 700 members of the Climate Change Education Solutions Network, also known as CCESN. And so many of these participants either lived in West Michigan, somewhere else in the US, and also some lived globally as well. And the interviews were conducted, recorded, and transcribed on Zoom and coded in MaxQDA for the analysis. Our questions for the interviews were really sectioned into two parts. There was individual happiness-centered questions and then more of the global happiness-centered questions. And these were some of the examples of the questions we asked.
As for the interview analysis portion, we analyzed the results using MaxQDA, and MaxQDA is the program that is designed to help analyze qualitative data. In more specifics, we use our transcripts to analyze. We conducted a thematic analysis of the interview data by extracting prevalent themes that were related to environmental attitudes and sustainability. And our analysis was structured around a custom coding framework, which allowed us to categorize some key thematic elements drawn from the interview transcripts. The coding process facilitated the identification of some dominant themes, such as connection to nature, sustainable living practices, environmental advocacy and concern, the impact of the environment on well-being, as well as the role of education and society in environmental issues. MaxQDA also was able to generate a word cloud, and we can see that some of the more prevalent words that were used throughout the interview process were conservation, energy, outdoor, health, environment, green practices, sustainable, sustainability, renewable, climate, living, policy, warming, carbon, environmental, farming, garden, and mental as well. Some common themes that were seen based on the interview results were the environment playing a crucial role in a lot of the participants' mental and physical well-being, with many of them finding peace, happiness, and health benefits from just being in nature. We also saw that activities such as gardening, walking, and engaging in any outdoor volunteer work were very common. There was also a trend of adopting sustainable habits such as local food consumption, gardening, and minimizing waste as well. The participants also emphasized the importance of regenerative practices, and they also acknowledged that there was insufficiency of current sustainability efforts. They also had a shared concern for climate change, the impact of fossil fuels, and the importance of local and global environmental advocacy. And they also acknowledged that there was a need for community action and policy changes to address any environmental challenges. And they also looked at and talked about the education and environmental issues and stated that the personal responsibility towards the environment is seen as key to fostering a more sustainable future for all. As for the interview results, looking at the 5 key themes that we drew from the transcripts, the frequency of themes, and with the most frequent being the impact of environment on well-being and environmental advocacy and concern throughout the interviews. And then we also looked at the importance of themes, and importance was subjective and was solely evaluated based upon the principle that the more time and detail the participant devoted to discussing a topic, the more significant it was to them. And we evaluated that on a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 being the least important and 10 being the most important. And we saw that environmental advocacy and concern and the impact of the environment on well-being were the most discussed or the most important themes throughout the interviews. As for the interview results, this is a table that summarizes the frequency and importance based on the 5 themes. We also looked at the overall attitudes towards sustainability and the environment throughout the interview. We had 3 results, positive, negative, or mixed. For positive, we saw that it was at a 61.5%, which is the significant majority of the attitudes of the participants. And they were positive, which reflected that they had optimism about sustainability efforts and environmental practices. There were mixed attitudes at 15.4%. This was a smaller portion, where individuals recognized the importance of environmental sustainability, but they also expressed some concerns about some current challenges and the effectiveness of current sustainable efforts. And then as for the negative at 23.1%, this indicated that they were pessimistic or frustrated with some current environmental conditions, sustainability efforts, or the perceived lack of progress in addressing current environmental challenges. As for these survey results, one of our first questions was a general question assessing how happy the participants were from a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being extremely unhappy and 5 extremely happy. And we can see that the majority of participants scaled either a 4 or 5 of being either somewhat happy or extremely happy. We also asked them a couple of questions that were related to community and environmental satisfaction and evaluated from a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being very dissatisfied and 5 being very satisfied. And we can see that satisfaction with the opportunities to enjoy nature and access to green spaces appears to be high, which indicates that these are well-received aspects of the respondents' communities. Air quality and water quality satisfaction are mixed, but there is a trend towards satisfaction, which should suggest that these may not be major concerns within the respondents' communities. There's also a diverse response to the impact of tourism, which shows that opinions are varied on whether tourism is having a positive or negative effect on the respondents' area. This is another set of questions evaluating whether they strongly disagree or strongly agree with a couple of statements that evaluate some environmental concerns. And the statements that were related to the loss of natural environments, such as the loss of rainforests and natural lands being replaced by development, showed strong feelings of concern or sadness. There was also some skepticism, as seen in the statement. Most environmentalists are pessimistic and somewhat paranoid, which has a more scattered response, but does trend towards agreement. And there was also a very strong agreement seen with the statement. One of the most important reasons to conserve is to ensure a continued high standard of living for humans, which indicates that the respondents connect environmental conservation with quality of life. This was also the last set of survey questions, and these were regarding environmental perceptions. And we can see that the statements such as humans are seriously harming the environment have strong agreement, which indicates that a significant concern among respondents about human impact on the environment. There's also a notable agreement with the idea that the Earth is like a spaceship with very limited room and resources, which suggests that the respondents do acknowledge that Earth's resources are finite. There's also the statement of humans were meant to rule over the rest of nature, which shows a mixed response, but trends towards disagreement, implying that respondents may not view humans as dominant over nature. There were a couple of limitations for this study for both the interview and survey portion. We do want to acknowledge that this is a preliminary investigation, and we have no intention of making any conclusive statements. The primary aim of this research was to test and develop research methodologies rather than produce definitive results. There was also, for the frequent park visitors who are more likely to be environmentally conscious, were more likely to introduce a selection bias. There was also a self-selection bias in interviews, as participants are those who are already engaged and interested in environmental issues. In interviews, we had a more culturally diverse pool. However, they did lack diversity in educational and economic backgrounds, which could potentially skew results towards a specific demographic. And the initial framework and ethical considerations were also guided by IRB standards, which influenced the scope and approach of this project. There was also some researcher bias that was occurring because of the researchers' own beliefs, attitudes, and perspectives that influenced the interpretation of the data for the interview and survey results. And this can lead to a skewed understanding of the participants' responses and could compromise the validity of the findings. There was also a discrepancy between the local and global perspectives due to the surveys capturing a more immediate localized viewpoint, while the interviews providing a broader global context. And the surveys were conducted exclusively in one park during the summer and only on sunny days, which limited participant diversity and could potentially affect the results due to environmental conditions and seasonal activities. We only had about 20 surveys completed, which indicated a small sample size that does not represent the broader population. And all interviewees were members of the CCESN community, which indicated a pre-existing interest and engagement in environmental issues. And the majority of interview participants were also highly educated and belonged to higher income brackets, which could influence the study's findings and limit its applicability to a wider audience. And our total number of interviews conducted was also 11, which also was a limited set of qualitative data.
So some concluding thoughts. Based on the limited sample of evidence, we conclude that most people involved in this study reported feeling generally happier while exposed to green spaces and also being engaged in sustainable practices. Almost all the interview participants also expressed deep concerns about the state of the environment, causing nostalgia and also a lot of sadness as well. And lastly, despite this limitation, our study provides a useful, innovative methodological framework that can be replicated at a broader scale to gain deeper insights into the relationships of happiness with environmental and ethics and attitudes towards sustainability. And this is our key bibliography. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kate and Bushra, for another excellent presentation. That was very, very interesting and thought-provoking. I'm sure those of you who are following us right now online, either on YouTube or on webinar, probably have many questions, perhaps trying to dive deeper in understanding of your own happiness and its relationship to sustainability. So please do send questions through the Q&A as they come to your mind. I see some students from my classes attending the presentation as well. So if you're writing paper about this presentation, I'm also very interested in your feedback, and definitely do send your questions. Meanwhile, I do have questions to you. So obviously that was an opportunity perhaps to think about our own happiness and how our own happiness and sense of well-being is related to our own attitudes towards sustainability and our own access to nature. So could you please share what you have learned about yourself and just probably your own thoughts about your own future from doing this research?
Yeah, I mean, I've always noticed that when I'm outside in the park or anywhere in nature, I always just feel so much happier and calmer and more relaxed as well. And it was really cool when we were doing the interviews to see how other people felt that as well. And also like how it could be a really good social thing and just makes you really happy. And it was cool to kind of like solidify those thoughts and feelings and see other people experience it as well.
Yeah, for me, as I saw with a lot of the interview participants as well, there were generally positive feelings or attitudes whenever one was involved in nature, which is something that I also personally feel. So whenever I am engaged in activities such as gardening or hiking or walking in parks, there is an overall feeling of satisfaction or happiness. But there was also, once there was an acknowledgement of existing natural issues or climate issues, or being able to perceive them in real time, some of the changes to the climate and to the environment, that does skew your attitude and your feeling, maybe not particularly towards the environment, but about yourself and about the world as a whole as well. So the more that one learns about how these changes negatively impact the environment, the more likely one is to have a negative attitude, which is something that I perceived for myself as well, and saw in several interview participants and their thoughts as well.
Well, thank you for sharing this. And so you started this research with this big question about inconclusive, really state of understanding of the relationship between human happiness and environmental sustainability based on our literature review. And we saw that there are some studies that suggest that there is a strong agreement, strong consonance between human happiness and environmental sustainability or community sustainability. And others suggest that because pursuit of happiness requires more and more consumption of resources, especially in wealthier countries, that actually can be a huge source of collective unhappiness for the world, and obviously lack of environmental sustainability. So what is your main finding? What do you think now about this contradictory relationship? And is it consonance? Is it dissonance? Is it both? And was you able to prove your hypothesis true or false?
From the analysis with the themes in MaxQDA, I found that our hypothesis was mostly correct, and people who do practice sustainable actions and spend more time outside do feel generally more happy, especially while they're doing those activities as well.
Yeah, for me, I found that in general, happiness was pretty subjective per person, and what it detailed to them and what it meant for them. So between each participant, whether that's towards the surveys or the interviews, they all had a different meaning of happiness and what that entailed for them. And so happiness can look a little bit different for them, but for the most part, whenever they had the ability or access to connect with nature, or have access to natural things like gardening or being able to hike or walk, or have access to healthy and green spaces, that corresponded with a more positive attitude, or a more generally happier attitude, versus if one did not have access to those things. But there was also a disconnect with, if one was engaging in sustainable practices and one was connected with nature and one was able to have access to some of the natural resources, but because they have access to those things, they can firsthand see some of the changes and some of the negative impacts of climate change on the environment. And so that ends up skewing their happiness and their attitudes and making them a little bit more pessimistic and have a negative perception as well of the environment, not because that it has done something bad to them, but they acknowledge that humans have done something bad to it, and that it is at a point where it has changed and would end up impacting them as well in terms of their mental and physical well-being.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your excellent answers. Thank you for sharing this really fascinating research and very interesting comments and reflections. And I hope that you will have more opportunities to continue this research, perhaps with a much broader sample, perhaps not only in West Michigan, but all over the world. So this is the last chance for our audience to send one question through the Q&A, because we are running out of time. And we will be moving to the presentation to Sophia Elhart in 1 minute. So if there is one burning question, feel free to send it. Otherwise, we will be moving to the next presenter in less than 1 minute. Oh, wow, what a great virtual climate change student symposium this year. So we had some really excellent presentations this morning on the impacts of climate change on banana production in Central America, on impacts of climate change on coral reefs in Australia. Some really fascinating local research on climate change adaptation and mitigation planning in Michigan cities, and also on relationships between happiness, land ethics, sustainability, and access to nature. And now we're about to start our fifth and last, but not the least, presentation in this session, and this is the impact of climate change on the wildlife in the Great Lakes area by Sophia Elhart. And Sophia is a student in Environmental Studies in Geography for 12, Global Climate and Environmental Change, working with me on this project this winter, and she's here to share her research. So welcome, Sophia, and I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. So my presentation is on the impact of climate change and on the impact of climate change on the wildlife in the Great Lakes. Some keywords that I used: climate change, Great Lakes, wildlife, habitat loss, invasive species. My abstract is here. I won't read the whole thing, but practically, due to climate change, there has been an increase in invasive species, toxic algal blooms, and all kinds of issues for the wildlife surrounding the Great Lakes and in the Great Lakes region. And I'm looking to figure out how exactly, or what are some of the ways that climate change is and has been impacting wildlife in our in this region's area. My study area is the Great Lakes region, as you can see here. It surrounds the Great Lakes. I seek to analyze different information and figure out some of the various impacts that climate change has had on this region and its wildlife. Animals play such an important role in our ecological web that without some of these basic animals that are facing problems due to climate change, we wouldn't have some of this. We would have issues. They control populations, spread pollen, seeds, recycle nutrients, and they are even indicators of environmental health and how climate change is affecting our world, which I will talk a little bit more about later. So in general, I'm going to be talking about HABs, or harmful algal blooms, the effects of temperature change on the lakes and its inhabitants, invasive species impact, and talk a little bit about what are some potential things that we could do. So I began my research with just Google Scholar, the university library, and kind of got some general ideas of what I wanted to go forward with. And then as I started to specify a little bit more, figuring out what some of these major problems were and what I wanted to hone in on, I was searching a little bit more using the library. And then I also spoke with some experts. I spoke with John Jensen via email, and I spoke with Russell Kuhl via telephone. I had sent him some emails, but over the phone, I had spoken with him. John Jensen is a professor of, excuse me if I butcher this word, Ametrius. He has a PhD from MSU, a PhD, master's from MSU, and a bachelor's from ULMA. And he is a professor of freshwater studies. And then Russell Kuhl is a senior scientist and has a PhD from Massachusetts Tech and a bachelor's in chem from California. They both work through the University of Wisconsin through the Sea Grant. Some of these other areas, some of these other things that I have referenced or used throughout my project: the EPA is the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Great Lakes Observing System, as well as the Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory and the GLISA. Another reference that I used that I really enjoyed was The Worth of Water. It is a movie, it's free on YouTube. If you have some time and want to get some more information on this kind of area, please check it out. It is really, really fantastic. So what is an HAB, or a harmful algal bloom? And what is algae to begin with? Algae, in simple terms, is a single cell plant that lives in the water. They can be found in all kinds of water all over, from salt to fresh water. But what is the difference between good versus bad algae? On their own, algae and cyanobacteria are not good or bad, but it is in abundance that when they become an issue, and we need them, I mean, to some degree. They are one of the major oxygen producing plants and sustain life on the world, throughout the world. But when they grow too much at once and they spread rapidly, they can become really, really problematic. This chart shows some different areas that are having some of these issues. Cyanobacteria is the main issue that we are seeing. It's also commonly called blue-green algae. It is a type of phytoplankton found in water. Although they're not technically algae, they chose to, we used to call it blue-green algae, even though it isn't technically that. But it is a massive problem. This is a picture of Lake Erie during a bloom of this blue-green algae. And actually in August of 2014, residents in Ohio, in Toledo, woke up and were told, do not use your tap water because this algae infected their tap water. You could not touch it, you couldn't wash your hands, you really weren't even supposed to be near it. It was so toxic, and it took several days to completely clear it up. Why is it bad? What exactly, what can this toxic stuff do? Well, for humans, it can cause things like stomach pains, headaches, neurological symptoms, vomiting, diarrhea, and even liver damage. As for animals, it can make them very sick or completely kill them. Animals can die within hours to days of swallowing the toxin. So if you think about how many animals you've seen drinking out of streams, rivers, lakes, if they consumed this wildlife, they would die due to this. This is from the Wisconsin Department of Health and Services, and explains a little bit of the different kinds of algae. All of them on the right are blue-green algae, while all of them on the left are just miscellaneous kinds of algae or surface stuff that would be on the water that is totally non-toxic. Why is this happening? So runoff from local farmland in and around the Great Lakes influence these algal blooms. They are a plant, so things running off from farms and other industrial areas, such as fertilizer, animal excrement, other farming byproducts, these will influence these blooms and feed these plants. This is a top-down view of the Great Lakes. As you can see, Lake Erie is a completely different color than the others. You can also see in several areas of the other ones some discoloration. That is algal blooms. So what exactly kind of impact do these blooms have on the rest of the lake? I'm so sorry, I started reading my next note without. So the other impact that algae has on the lake is in relation to seasonal hypoxia. Seasonal hypoxia basically is during the warm months, there will be a stratification of the water. There will be a layer of warm water and then a layer of cool water. And the layer of cool water will be they will be very separated, and they will not mix until the two sections of water become close enough that they can start mixing again. If you've dove off a boat or a pier in the summer, and you notice like it's pretty comfortable for the first couple feet, and then once you start getting lower, it gets really cold, that is due to seasonal hypoxia. And as the seasons get longer and as these warm and cold bouts change in severity and length, this also impacts how the lake works. I'm not going to read this entire chart, but it does explain seasonal hypoxia. But the biggest problem is during this hypoxic event, the lower stratification area, the lower area, the cool area, has a set amount of oxygen. And as the season continues, the oxygen is used by the animals and the plants that live and exist in that lower section, waiting for the rest of the water to cool. And they have to live off that base set amount of oxygen. So I made an animation. I referenced an animation or drawing, I guess, that was done in The Way of Water, but I made this one just to make it a little more clear. So this is an example of the stratification. You'll have a warm layer of water and the cold layer of water with your fish and your plants in the bottom section. So what happens with algae as it gathers on the top, eventually it will fall and it will sink to the bottom. And as it sinks to the bottom, it then starts absorbing that extra oxygen because it needs oxygen to survive, just like it needs oxygen, wants oxygen, just like everything else. So as it absorbs its oxygen, it leaves no oxygen in this lower area, causing plants and animals to die because it's absorbing all of the leftover oxygen that they need. And especially as these seasons get longer, as these warm seasons, or as our falls get warmer, or our springs start sooner, these areas that have this low oxygen are starting to have to stretch the amount that they use even further and further and further and further. And this algae begins to make even more of a problem because they're absorbing what this area is already lacking. The other major issue that I found is due to invasive species, quagga and zebra mussels to be exact. So how did they get here? So quagga mussels and zebra mussels are a fairly new introduction to the Great Lakes. Zebra mussels actually arrived around 1990, but they started noticing them showing up a little bit due to the Great Lakes opening up to the ocean in the St. Lawrence Waterway in 1955. But we started noticing them more seriously in the 90s. And then the quagga mussels, we noticed a big boom of them in around 2003. Obviously, when they first started introducing these things, we didn't think that they were a big deal, but we now know that they are a really big deal because the lakes did not have a filter feeding organism before this. So basically what a filter feeder is something that eats phytoplankton, that eats those micro plant and micro creatures and eats them and makes waste, and then that's just how it lives. Prior to that, the Great Lakes did not have any of this. They have done such an effective job at this that now the lakes are far more clear. I spoke with, or in my email with Dr. Jensen, or Professor Jensen, he said that back before the plankton, or before the zebra mussels and before the mussels were here, when you were diving underwater, you could see about 6 feet in front of you. Now, today, more commonly, you see between 20 and 50 feet in front of you. And to just give you more of a reference, because that's how I am, this is like, I looked this up. 6 feet is about the size of like a twin bed, like head to end. And then 35 feet, which is kind of between the two numbers he gave me, is about a public bus, like the length of a public bus, which I thought was crazy how much phytoplankton and zooplankton that the mussels are filtering out of the water. Another issue and that impacts this, like, how does climate change, what does this have to do with the mussels? So when I spoke with Professor Kuhl, I was asking him about the mussels because that was something in particular that he had studied extensively. And he said that I asked about the reproduction and how the temperature affects them. he said that the reproduction of these mussels is constant. It's the survivability that changes. And 2 of these mussels can make up to 500,000 babies, which is absolutely insane to me. And the temperature and the amount of phytoplankton and zooplankton in the area is what impacts whether or not they survive and make it to adulthood. I was reading some different articles, and according to a article that I also have a reference from in the next slide, from Great Lakes Now, they were talking with some fishermen, and one of the things that kept Lake Superior protected during Lake Erie and Lake Michigan were being infected by these mussels was how cold it was. And now that it's starting to rise in temperature due to climate change, it is becoming more susceptible to these invasive species, and it's leaving less for these animals, these whitefish, yellow perch, plankton eaters, the alewife and sisios. I'm sorry, those are names of fish that I'm not very good at pronouncing. But it's leaving a lot less for those animals that do eat these phytoplankton and zooplankton. So this is another, this was a image from the Great Lakes Now, the article that was talking about the mussels. As you can see, throughout the years, the mussel density has changed drastically. From the 90s, you can see where the zebra mussels were, and by 2010, we have far less because the quagga mussels began to overtake, and they are a massive problem. As you can see, in Lake Michigan, they cover practically the entire thing. They are incredibly invasive, and there's even studies that people are trying to find shipwrecks in the Great Lakes before these mussels destroy them due to how they filter and how they degrade biomaterial. So in conclusion, climate change has heavily impacted the way wildlife in the Great Lakes region has been existing and living for the past century or so, and it has a direct impact on various species and their sustainability. I was able to answer my initial question of what are some of the ways that climate change is currently impacting the wildlife in the Great Lakes region directly. And what are some things that we could do about it? Well, speaking with both of these professors and scientists, one that I found really interesting that Dr. Kuhl mentioned to me was the removal of dams. And some of these things, although not perfect and ideal, would help us maintain the water in a way that we struggle to do now. The problem with dams is that there is a buildup of sediment and things behind the dams, which leads to toxic elements and things from the runoff of farms and whatever to build up behind these dams. And then these creatures that are drinking from this area lead to getting some kind of toxic poisoning of some sort. And it has even been a little bit of study has been put into it in why it is more common that people are getting mercury poisoning, because there is such a buildup around these dammed areas. There's such a buildup of toxic material in that sediment due to coal burning and the sediment resuspension of these dams. Another issue that is being considered and talked about due to these dams is the good material that is in there that's not being released back out to the lake, that's being stuck behind these dams with the other toxic material. Could potentially be something that would help defend against the toxic algal blooms. So removing some of these dams that are more for recreation and not super vital to the infrastructure of things could help release some of the positive nutrients that we need in our lakes to help prevent against these toxic overgrowths of blue-green algae. But the problem is you don't also want to release the toxic material. In addition to that, another thing that I noticed and I spoke with Dr. Kuhl about that I thought was really interesting was the migration of birds and how we can use that now to tell the difference between how it was before climate change started taking such a drastic impact and now. He was telling me about ducks in the area and how they'd stop in late November, early December, and he was very confused because they should have been south by then, but because it is taking so long for things to freeze over and for things to get as cold as they need to, especially up towards Canada, these birds are migrating much later in the year, which is a really clear indication of climate change and how much things have changed in the recent years. There's so many different things that have changed that the conditions for baby fish and small animals and are becoming very unreliable. The flow of water due to ice melting used to be very consistent, and now it's not, leading fish to not exactly know when to spawn and what are the best times to go lay eggs. And that can lead to less fish, and subsequently, as generations continue, less and less as they're unable to spawn at the right time. So one of the things Dr. Jensen said to me, which I found really impactful, was I asked him, what do you think, we need to do? And he sent me a quote from someone on the Kenyan on the Supreme Court that said, if you want to change the law, you must first change hearts and minds. Well, they were speaking to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and he was telling me about Earth Day and how it was back in the 70s and the trigger for what it had done and how it's changed over the years. And he ended his email with me, I was there and now it's your turn. And I think it's so important for people to recognize how much impact we have on the lakes and what the lakes do for us, and how much things would change if we lost even 2 or 3 species, how much impact that would have on our lives, I mean, as a whole. So yeah. Thank you.
Well, big round of applause to Sophia. And Sophia, thank you so much for your really outstanding presentation, beautiful slides, and so much information. I can clearly see that you really have become an expert on impacts of climate change on the Great Lakes and so many, different complex processes happening there. So thank you for sharing this really wonderful presentation. Again, for those of you who are following Sophia's presentation right now on live webinar, please remember that you can use Q&A and send questions. And I see some people from our class, so please do not hesitate to send questions to Sophia right away. And she's here to answer them. If you are watching this video later on YouTube, please do send your questions through GVSU Climate Change Education Solutions Network, and I will relay your questions to Sophia. So Sophia, as your professor in this class where you completed this project, I am absolutely rejoiced to see how positive and how inspiring and how informative were your interactions with experts during this semester, and you have connected with University of Wisconsin experts. What is your advice, on other students on how to make these interactions with experts successful and enjoyable for you and informative? Obviously, you were very successful in this. So what is your secret?
So I actually did it wrong initially. So after I had figured out exactly what I did need to do, because initially I was contacting different kinds of experts, and then I kind of got a better idea of what I needed to do. I began with calling and leaving a voicemail, just because I prefer talking on the phone. And then when I didn't get a response, when none of them had picked up, I then made emails and sent emails to each one of them. I got a response from Dr. Jensen, and I really wanted to talk to Dr. Cool, and his phone specifically, I think was the only one that had a personally recorded voice message. So I was like, okay, if I really want to talk to him, I know he's on his phone and I know he answers his phone because he had the recording, and he seemed very personable when I listened to the recording. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to keep calling him during operation hours to see if he responds. And I think I called him 3 or 4 times before he picked up. And the one time he picked up, he answered the same way his recording answered. So I was like, oh, darn. And then it just stopped. He didn't say the rest of the recording. I was like, oh, he picked up. Great. And I had all of my questions that I had sent him in the email. I had them in front of me, and I had notes on my computer up. So as I was talking with him, I took notes, just because I function better when I'm just talking back and forth with somebody. So I was prepping for that way, and was able to ask him all the questions that I wanted and get all the answers I wanted in a more fluent way. I find it much more natural to talk with someone and interview someone than send emails back and forth, because when things, pop into my head, I'm like, oh yeah, this. I don't want to send 1,000 emails adding, 2 sentences each time. So if they have a phone number and they answer it, I highly recommend it. I found that really easy for me, at least.
Well, thank you, Sophia, for sharing this. And we have a question from Max. Is there anything we can do about the zebra mussels? Or will this be the new normal for the Great Lakes? What are your thoughts about it?
So zebra mussels are less of an issue at this point than quagga mussels actually are. I had the statistics pulled up just a second ago, so let me pull them back up. But the government spends quite a bit of money killing off, basically, all the mussels in the Great Lakes. But with how quickly they reproduce, there isn't really a whole lot we can do. It is basically our new normal. Prior to their entry into the Great Lakes, we didn't have any filter feeders at all. So this introduction of them in the 90s and early 2000s became a really big issue, because prior to that, everything that ate those kinds of things were the only things here doing that. So these filter feeders have become an issue. As of 2022, the Detroit Free Press says that federal agencies are budgeting $42 million to combat some of the invasive species in our area, as well as $100 million annually just for mussels. And that's not including things like sea lamprey and other issues that we have in our area. But these mussels are more or less our new normal. They reproduce so fast, and they feed on things that are so prevalent in our lakes that they're also highly, highly adaptable. The biggest thing is that they don't flourish as well in warmer climates. So as we do have the lakes warming up, we are in a better position, but at the same time, those warmer climates increase their food supply. So while they may not be flourishing as well just internally, they do have access to much more food, which then leads them to be able to continue to reproduce and populate and survive. So it's a very give and take scenario. But but for killing them, it's not like we can, poison them like a weed, because that will get into the water supply and harm everything else. So to some degree, it is our new normal, but I think at some point we will be able to do something to limit them. But there are good things that they do. We are able to use zebra mussels specifically. There have been studies used to test the toxicity of water, because they'll close when it's too toxic, and we're able to use them to test some things, which is nice, but the complete takeover that they have of the lakes is super unreasonable, and we need to find a way to some degree to limit their spread, and I think it will take a while at a minimum.
Well, thank you for answering this question. Yes, I was also wondering, like what would we have, quagga mussel overtook zebra mussel? What's next, right? Like would we have another species that would be competing or eating quagga mussel? And hopefully that wouldn't be Asian carp. But which is
It's hard
vegetarian. This is still a
because
question.
because the mussels, actually, the way the quagga mussels absorb toxin, they have actually been proven to be a large impactor of birds, migratory birds and shorebirds. They have recently discovered that it is giving them, oh, I forget the name of it, flu. It's an avian flu that's killing off hundreds of thousands of birds. But these birds that do eat these mussels are dying because of how these mussels absorb the toxins.
It really shows how complex and interrelated are all these processes in the Great Lakes. And so going back to connections between the Great Lakes and the climate change, you spoke about the possibility of removing the hydro dams, and like, of course, this is another big question. So we need hydropower to supply energy coming from renewable sources to reduce emissions from fossil fuels. But on the other hand, hydropower comes with its own set of environmental issues, and some of these dams are pretty old. There were also studies suggesting that these old reservoirs are sources of methane, that is of course, greenhouse gas. So where is the balance? How we, how we can use hydropower to mitigate climate change, but on the other hand, what can be done and to what extent we can remove use of hydropower to release those nutrients from the reservoirs in the lake, and how we can do it safely, because you have also mentioned that these reservoirs are full of many pollutants that we don't want to be released into the lakes.
So, so obviously, like you said, some of this hydropower is necessary, and there are also like the Sioux locks. We need the locks for the shipping, and getting rid of those is just not practical. There are different scenarios where we could remove certain lakes or certain dams that would not have as much of a impact as removing the Sioux locks, removing some of these water wheels. Removing maybe some of the issue that with this is people are saying, letting fish swim through more freely, being able to have more access to the water. But a lot of these dams are used for making recreational areas or limit flooding in various areas. So finding the best solution is really, really difficult. And on top of that, they are trying to figure out the best way to sift out those pollutants from the waste that gathers at the base of dams. Something that I believe they're doing in Sweden, which I really like the idea of, is they have a gate at some of their dams. And if you are habitually online like me, you probably have seen this before. It's called the fish doorbell. And they had a gathering of fish trying to go upstream, and predators began to realize that they would gather in this area, and there needed to be a watchman or somebody who every couple of hours would go press a button and open a door for the fish to continue upstream. Well, predators started to realize, hey, fish are gathering here, that's great. And then they would just go eat them. And it resulted in a big issue for the fish population. I think doing things like that in some of those more necessary dams that are protecting areas from flooding or are hydropower or like the locks, you know, allowing these animals that need to get through and maybe some of the sediment, depending on how the door works, having like smaller doors at the base that allows a little bit of water to get through, you know, allowing these animals to pass through when need be. The fish doorbell is an internet online sensation and went viral because people can go and they have a camera underwater. So when fish are at the door, people can click it, and enough people click it, then the person who watches over the fish door knows, okay, there's fish waiting and I have to open it so they can get through. And, you know, simple things like that, just allowing nature to exist as it once did without our human intervention could offer some solace. You know, some of these exclusively recreational dams that are put up to make lakes that are just for fun, especially in Michigan or in the Great Lakes area. We live in the most beautiful freshwater area in the entire world. We have access to more fresh water than anyone else in the entire world. Why we are adding dams to create more and potentially interrupt the ecological flow of things just doesn't make sense. You know, if it's a matter of driving an extra 20 minutes to a different lake, drive the extra 20 minutes and don't detrimentally impact your ecosystem, you know?
Well, thank you for your very detailed answer. Thank you, Sophia. I have learned a lot today from your presentation, and I'm looking forward to watching the recording again. So thank you so much. Thank you to all speakers. And I think we have answered all questions. You have answered all questions from me and from the audience. So it's really time to say goodbye, unfortunately. So thank you all for joining this GVSU Virtual Climate Change Student Symposium 2024. This is already the 4th symposium, and of course, this is an extended session within GVSU 28th Student Scholar Day. So I hope you also would have opportunity to browse through some other sessions in person and online and see many poster presentations in Kirchhoff and in Henry Hall. I want again to give a round of virtual applauds to all our presenters. And if you missed any of those presentations, you can watch them online at www.gvsu.edu/CCS or on the website of the Office of Undergraduate Research and Scholarship. And I believe they will be available for the next 2 weeks at the Office of Undergraduate Research and Scholarship website, and they will stay forever for the observable future at the CCS website, where you can enjoy all these presentations. So once again, many thanks to Abby, Miranda, and Brailee for their outstanding presentation on climate change and its effects on banana production in Central America. And they shared today many climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies and reflected on various agricultural innovative techniques in Central America based on their bibliographic research, simulations, and conversations with experts. I also wanted to say a huge thank you to Claire and Chris, who shared their research on impacts of climate change and coral reefs along the Australian coast. Again, we saw many examples of application of online tools, conversations with experts, various data sets, and of course, bibliographic research that was conducted very effectively and very well presented with many great reflections. Many thanks to Bushra, Rashrash, and Carron for their 2 excellent presentations, one about equity and inclusion in climate action and adaptation plans of Michigan cities. That was supported by the Marby Fellowship from the Johnson Center for Philanthropy, in Grand Rapids. And the second research project, A Search for Happiness Through Connection with Environment and Sustainability, that was supported this summer by the grant from the Office of GVSU Office for Undergraduate Research and Scholarship. Really enjoyed this presentation, so many interesting insights, and again, very heavily social science research, very much rooted in surveys and interviews, as well as work with bibliographic data. Finally, the last but not the least, this excellent presentation by Sophia Elhart on climate change effects on wildlife in the Great Lakes. So many thanks to all speakers, all presenters, and all the entities who supported this research, GVSU Climate Change Education Solutions Network, Geography and Sustainable Planning Department, and of course, Office of Undergraduate Research and Scholarship, who provided this outstanding platform, GVSU Student Scholar Day, as well as Johnson Center for Philanthropy. I hope you all enjoyed this session. We will see you again next year, and you can access these presentations at www.gvsu.edu/CCS. Have a wonderful day.